Here on Daf Vav Omed Aleph, 4 lines down from the top. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Shehesham Zaken O Talmud. So we have a situation of a field, and there was a kever somewhere lost in the field, and therefore the field is tamei. We don't know where the kever is located. If we have testimony that we could rely on that the field was plowed, then it's not metame b'tumas oel. And who qualifies to give this testimony? It's either a zaken or a talmud. We don't rely on the testimony except of these experts. These are reliable. When there's a Talmud Chacham in the town, called Mili de Masa Alei Ramye. He's in charge of overseeing what goes on in the town. That is his responsibility. He's knowledgeable, and he has to write down, for example, if a certain field was marked for Tumah, and now we want to remove that status of Tumah because it was plowed, he has to be careful about that and know about that so he can report. Rabbi Yehuda, Mata Evan Mitsuyenes. What happens if there's a field, but there's only one single stone that has sid on it that indicates Tachteha Tameh, that underneath that stone there's a kever, and that's Tameh. However, Shtayim, if there are two stones that are close one to the other, then do we assume that there's Tumah in between the two stones? Im yesh sid beinehem, they used to pour lime to connect these stones, and the lime would sort of solidify on the ground, and that was a siman that there was tumah there. So if there's sid between these two stones, these two markers, then beinehem tameh. Im ein sid beinehem, if there's no line between the stones, then beinehem tar. The fact that they omitted the sid, the lime or the plaster between the two stones, that is a testimony that there's no tumah between them. In other words, in order to set up a marker and indicate that between these 2 points there's a kever and it's tameh, they would put lime in between the two stones, connecting them. So the Gemara now says the following: the afagav deleka choresh. Are you telling me that between these two stones, in the absence of sid, we assume it's tar, and there's no indication whatsoever of charicha? For Sanya, we have a brisa that seems to indicate the exact opposite, that it's not enough that there's no lime in between the stones to prove that it's tar, but rather we need additional support and evidence from to prove that there was a plowing done. Motza even achas mitzuyenes tachtei tameh. Shtayim im yesh choresh beinehem tar v'im la beinehem tameh. No mention here that we can rely on the fact that there's sid between the two stones, but rather we need choresh beinehem. There's got to be an indication that there was a plowing done between the two stones. That is proof positive that there's no kever in between the two stones. Since we don't know with certainty that there was ever tumah between the two stones, we assume that there might have been. And even if on the tzad that there was tumah, then we assume that through plowing, through charisha, whatever was there was spread throughout, and there's no shear of tumah. Therefore, we assume the area is tar. But for that, we need proof that there was charicha beinehem. Amar Papa says that I can reconcile the statement, the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda with this brisa. How so? Hacha in the brisa, that you need that extra criterion, that proof from the plowing. That's kshasid shafach al rosheim umerudel lekanu lekan. See that they poured this sid on top of the two stones, and it spread between the two stones, and we're not sure, did it fall from the stones or was it placed deliberately between the two stones to indicate that there's tumah there? And since there is a possibility that they poured it in such a way that the lime would land between the two stones, then we need further proof that this is not a marker that indicates that there's tumah there. Only if we find some sort of an indication that there was plowing between the two stones, then the area between the two stones is tar. And if you're asking me why is it that there's some, let's say, vestige or very thin amount of lime in between the two stones, that's due to the plowing. When there was plowing, then what happened is from the stones, a certain amount of lime fell down and got stuck to the ground. Again, we need that indication of plowing. Without it, the Brisa says we have to assume tameh between the two stones. Elo, if there was no plowing whatsoever, then sid de beni benihu. We're going to assume that that lime was not just some sort of an overflow that fell from the lime that was poured on the markers themselves, but that the entire area between the two stones is tameh. If there's no lime whatsoever between the two stones, then we assume that the area between the two stones is tar. There was never ever there to begin with, even if we don't find charisha, even without that extra indicator of charisha. We don't need the plowing. That's Rabbi Yehuda Shita. Amar of Asi, Meitzar Echad Mitsuyan. They used to have boundaries around the field. It was kind of a strip that was elevated from the ground, and that was sometimes used, that meitzar, for adding a tziyun, a marker that could be seen at a distance to indicate that there's tumah there, that there was a dead corpse that was buried there. Now, in this case that Rabbi Yassi is addressing, there's only one boundary, one strip of the field that has this marker on it. Hu tameh, that area itself, exactly there, is tameh. V'chol hasada kula tahora, but the entire balance of the field is considered tahora. Okay, then. So again, Rav Hasi is addressing a case where there's an elevated boundary strip on one side of the field, and let's say it's covered with sid, and since only one side of the field has this indicator, this tziyun, this marker, then we assume that the tumah is only in that area. So the elevated boundary strip, which is visible, as we said, from a distance, that marking indicates the ground beneath it is tameh. But shnayim, and even in the case where two of the field's boundaries, let's say the north and the east, have these strips that are marked, heim tmei mikol asada kula, tar. Even if there are three boundaries, then heim tmei mikol asada kula tahora. What would be in the case where the entire field had a suffix tumah and if it was tameh? Then arba, they would have to put four of these strips on the four of the elevated boundaries on all sides of the field. However, hein tahora means that the marker indicates that a little bit beyond this, within the circle that was bounded on all four sides by markers, a little bit beyond this is tumah. But there itself is no tumah. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Even if they put the boundaries here, maybe the tumah is somewhere in the middle of the field. No. We assume the tumah is right beyond the markers because we're not going to be mafsid any potential plowing area in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah says, "V'yotzim af ala kilayim," which means on Chol Moed Pesach, they sent inspectors to check and see for Kalayim. So it means they already warned the people at the beginning of the planting season that they should be careful not to plant two species together that would make it Kalayim. And then when it got to the point in the calendar that things were growing in the field, they would send out the inspectors to see if people were very careful. They obliged the warning. And if they found any kalayim, they would uproot the kalayim. Because, as we discussed back on Daf Gimel, I believe it was, there's an Isser of Kiyum kalayim. You're not allowed to keep kalayim. And again, the Lashon is Yotzim, that we are obligated to send out these Shluchei Bezdin. It's not just that we're allowed to do so, there's a requirement to do so in order to inspect for Kalayim on Chol Moed. We'll see soon why Chol Moed. Anyway, Pesach is the time when the grains begin to grow and Kalayim would be noticeable in the fields. So the Gemara says, "V'akalayim b'chol moed nafkinon." Are you telling me that there's no earlier date in which we should send out the shluchim? We have to wait and delay it until chol moed? That's not so. We should already begin it with the 15th of Adar, which is more than a month before chol moed. Reminu, we have a Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah doesn't exactly exist in this shape, in this form. This is a combination of a number of different Mishnayos in Shkolim. And it says the following: B'echad be'adar mashmim al hashkolim vel hakalayim. So already on Rosh Chodesh Adar, we're already warning the people in advance about Kilayim. And because we're going to need a new Trumas Halishka for the new year in Nisan, therefore already a month before that, on Rosh Chodesh Adar, we begin to collect the new round of shkolim. Every person was required to give a machzis hashekel for the purpose of filling up the Trumas Halishka. That's based on the pasuk. And what do we do with the money of the Trumas Halishka? That's for a carbon tzibur, based on the pasuk Zos olas chodesh b'chod shel chodshei hashana. And the Gemara Rosh Hashanah derives that each year there's a schadshus, a new purchase of karbanos tzibur from the newly donated funds, not from last year's funds, last year's machzah shekel, but from this machzah shekel, which were the new donations that were given from Aleph Adar until Aleph Nisan, during that month's period of time. On the 15th of Nisan, they read the Megillah in the large cities. That's Mukafim Chomim Mimos Yoshua ben Nun. And this Mishnah only mentions the Krochim here. However, the reason for that is because there are a number of events that take place on the 15th of Adar, and that's why the Mishnah emphasizes, number one, Kriyas HaMegillah and the Krochim. And then on that same day, Yotzim Lekavetz Es Hadrachim. This is following the winter season, and we have to make sure that the roads are clear of thorns. And Letakein Harachovos, there are many cracks and crevices in the streets. We call them today potholes, and they have to be filled in. They could be dangerous. And all this is because of the damage that was suffered during the winter months. And now it's ready for reparation. So the people will be able to come on Aliyah L'Regel for Chag HaPesach. Ulamoda mikvos. Now, during the course of the winter months, very often there was debris that fell into the various pools. There was mud and so forth because of the rains in the winter. And the mikvos, which were going to be used full capacity for Pesach, because people had to be retire themselves, we have to make sure that the mikvos are in spiffy condition. Osim called Sarchei Rabim. And in general, whatever is needed for the public, that should be attended to starting from the 15th of Adar. At that date, we have to make sure that the tziyunim, the markers that indicated tumah, were not obliterated during those winter months by the winds and so forth and so on. The Yotzim ala Kalayim. Already at the 15th of Adar, the Shluchim went out to see when and if there was Kalayim and Bruta Kalayim. So this dispatch of the inspectors was on the 15th of Adar, not like our mission that puts it at Chol Moed Pesach more than a month later. So the Gemara offers two different shitos to reconcile this apparent contradiction. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda. Kan Omar, according to one opinion, kan be bachir, kan be afil. Right, there are different stages in the development of the crop. There are early crops, there are late crops. Bachir are the early crops, afil are the late crops. So we have to send out the shluchim, the inspectors, on the 15th of Adar in order to inspect Kalayim from the early crops. That's the Bachir. Chol Moed Pesach, they will inspect the late growing crops, which is called Afil. The Chadamer, and the other reconciliation was Kan Bizroim, Vekan Biyurakos. The difference between grains and vegetables. Grains are planted early, what we call today in America, for example, it's a winter wheat. And those fields would be inspected as early as the 15th of Adar. Vegetables, on the other hand, are planted much later on, not in the winter, but in the spring. And therefore, the inspectors cannot go out to look for vegetables that might be Kalayim until Chol Moed Pesach. Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Yochanan, Lo Shanu El She'ein Nitzan Nika. When do we say that the earliest two calendar dates for the inspectors to go out is the 15th of Adar and Chol Moed Pesach? That's only if it's Ein Nitzan Nika, which means the Nitzan, or the beginnings of the sprouts, are not recognizable before these dates. Aval Nitzan Nikar, if, let's say, you can already recognize the sprouts and you could therefore identify Kilayim, is Yotzim Aleim, they could go immediately. We don't have to wait until these two dates. So these two dates are established as, let's say, the normative times for inspection. It's safe to assume that by these times, Kilayim will have grown enough so that they can be noticeable and they can be uprooted by the agents of Beis Din. But we're not strictly limited to these dates. You know, these are not necessarily the earliest dates of inspection. What's happens Chol Moed? You know, tell me, go out before Yontif, after Yontif. Why punct exactly on Chol Moed? Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yochanan, there was a logic behind it. The monies to pay the inspectors were taken from the Trumas Halishka. Now we have to try to protect the Trumas Halishka monies as much as we can, get the best deal. And Mishum Tzchar Pa'ula, the mostly got done that on Chol Moed no one's working. And therefore, anyone would be willing to take on a job that they get paid for, even with a low wage. So we can now get reduced wages during Chol Moed. And there's a long discussion here about whether or not you're allowed to take money for work on Chol Moed. Let's suffice it to say, which I think is the bottom line of this whole discussion, that the Rabbana made a special takana dispensation for the work of a mitzvah, and they allow of brooding Kalayim in this case, and they allow them to hire themselves out and make a profit and a wage. But again, the wages were relatively low, and that would protect the Trumas Halishka. Where does the schar come from to pay the inspectors? What was the other possibility? And Rav Zvid says from our Mishnah we see Lafuke that other possibility. There should be a penalty imposed on the person who violated Kalayim and forced, so to speak, the efforts of the Shluchei Beis Din to have to be Oker the Kalayim. They should be paying for that. So the Gemara says, my nafkalon minayu. Called Kama de Boy, Litelu. What difference do they make to us? Whatever the inspectors request should be given to them. And there should be no reason to hire them on Chol Moed to reduce the cost. If we're going to assume that the funds are paid from the violators of Isa Kilayim, because they're the ones who force us to uproot the Kilayim, then my nafkalamina kol kaba de boy litain lehu. Why should we schedule the inspection for Chol Moed if the payment is not coming from public funds? That's it. Now we talk about tarots, viad kama. In other words, you may have seeds of a different species that got mixed up with species of a different plant. And let's assume this happened inadvertently, b'shogeg. So we have a din of bittul, and the smaller amount is nullified when planted together with a larger amount. But at what point do we say that when the Shluchei Bezdin discover Kilayim, they should uproot the Kilayim? What's the measure? What's the ratio here between the other species and this one in the mixture such that it's considered Kilayim? Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, Ke'osa sheshaninu, like we learned through the Mishnah Kilayim, Kol Sa Sheyesh Ba. And here we turn to the Avav and Beis. We're talking about a saw. A saw is 6 kamen, and he's got a rova, which is a quarter of a kav. Zera mimin acher is then you buy it. We have to get rid of it. There's a violation of kiyum kilayim. Now you're talking about a rova of a kav, and there's 6 kavim in a saw. So we're talking about a ratio of, right? We multiply 6 by 4, because it's 1/4, and you get 1/24. So if there's a ratio already of a mixture of 1/24, then we require Yemait. So the Gemara immediately asks, for Tanya, Hiskinu Shim Afkirim Kol Kula. The word Yemayit seems to indicate that whatever that foreign species is that's generating some sort of mixture of Kilayim, we have to reduce it and make sure it's less than a rova kav to a saw. But the Brisa says that if the Shluchei Bezdin discovered Kilayim, they would completely be mafkir the Sada. They would decide that the Sada is hefker, ownerless. Lo kasha kan kodem takona kan li acher takona. So we're going to see now that there were 3 stages of a takana with regard to achieving the goal of these takanos, namely to discourage people from planting Kilayim. Isanya, Barichona, initially, we thought that the way of achieving our goal and discouraging people from planting Kilayim was a okrim mashlich lifnei behemtam. The Shluchei Bezdin would uproot that which was Kilayim, and it was thrown in front of the animals. Total law, almost the total loss for the violent. That should achieve our goal and discourage people from planting these mixtures of Kilayim. However, no. They were jumping for joy when the inspectors would uproot the Kilayim. And it was a double rejoicing. Achas, number one, on one hand, right? You have too much planted in a small area, and it's makish one or the other. So we want to get rid of it and thin it out. That's called weeding. The achas, and furthermore, instead of getting rid of the Kilayim, they fed it to their animals. Great. It's animal fodder for our animals. So therefore, they got to the second stage of the takana. now the Shluchei Bezdin would uproot the Kalayim and throw it out in the roads, and basically it was lost. At least they accomplished one of the two goals. They weren't feeding their animals anymore, but they were thinning out the fields. So they continued to grow Kilayim and say, all right, wait till the Shluchei Bezdin come and do our bidding, and they'll be okay the Kalayim and achieve the nikush that we need. Iskinu, finally, in the third and last stage, they established Yumafkirin Kol Sodas Kula. They declared the entire field to be Hefker. When it says Yemayit, that's before the Takana, the last stage of the Takana, when Bezdin established that the entire field would be Hefker. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Vav Amgis.